Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. The Great Lakes are...
You have come upon the Great Lakes Guys podcast. The podcast features not only the history, geography, and geology of the land, waters, and people of the Great Lakes Basin, but as well we interview talented people from around the region who form the innovative cultural web of music, arts, technology, and science of the Great Lakes Basin. And before getting to the podcast interview, we would like to thank Lee Murdoch, the Great Lakes Balladeer, who allowed us to use his recording of the song The Great Lakes Song. The Great Lakes Song was originally composed by Pat Daly, another prominent balladeer of the Great Lakes. Today we are beginning a series of podcast interviews on the history of the Willow Run Bomber Plant, situated near Ypsilanti, Michigan. Those persons not familiar with the Willow Run Bomber Plant may wonder, what is the big deal with a bomber manufacturing facility? What is the connection of this plant to all things Great Lakes? Well, let me tell you, this plant was one of the most significant manufacturing and technological efforts in all of such efforts associated with World War II. The story of the plant intertwines the drama of the Ford family, the political intrigue of the pre-war preparations for war, the Herculean effort to ramp up a manufacturing task that many considered impossible, including the Germans. We plan to have 4 podcasts that we hope will give listeners a broad view of the history of the plant. We hope to place the plant in the context of its time. And we hope to leave listeners with a feeling of pride over the unique effort extended to create this plant in the Great Lakes region during World War II. To this end, today we interview Karlschmid. Karl is a docent of the Yankee Air Museum and a docent of the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Karl is a historian whose expertise, among many topics, is in the history of the Willow Run Bomber Plant, with its inextricable connection with the Ford Motor Company and in the general context of the plant within its time. Karl obtained his M.A. in World War II studies from Arizona State University in conjunction with the National World War II Museum. We welcome Karl to the podcast. And today we're going to discuss the birth of the Willow Run Bomber Plant, one of the most significant wartime accomplishments, I think, World War II accomplishments in history. So Karl's going to tell us how the plant came to be, why it came to be here in Ypsilanti, Michigan, say, and not in the city of Detroit or nearer to the city of Detroit, and how this all fit in with the wartime effort, and what a humongous effort it was to create this plant and to create the bombers that came out of it. Okay, so Karl, where shall we begin?
Probably a little background is in order with the Ford family, and then also the property, and as you mentioned, the politics and things that were involved. I think there's probably a misconception out there that the Willow Run Bomber Plant and the B-24 Liberators that came from it were kind of the first attempt at building airplanes by Ford Motor Company and the Ford family. That would be incorrect. The Fords played around with airplanes in the 1920s to a degree, and then they actually got into more of a manufacturing situation. Something else as far as background goes to why it happened and how it happened, it really needs you need to focus on and look at Edsel Ford. Edsel, being Henry's only son, was when at the outbreak of World War I, Edsel was about, I want to make sure I get it right, he was about 23, 24, and he was already working at the company. But unfortunately for him, his father made a very public statement, many statements about Edsel not going to be drafted. It was not going to happen as far as Henry was concerned. He said, my son is not going to go off to fight. Even a few years before that, Henry came out to the world as a very strong pacifist. During the early stages of World War I, before the United States was involved, so about 1915, Henry made a very public splash. He chartered a boat, and several of his executive friends and other people sailed over to Europe in an attempt to stop World War I. It was very unsuccessful. The Allies didn't care. There was a war to be fought. There were men out on the field, and the ideas or the thoughts of a millionaire from the United States didn't really seem to matter. No one cared. So after that unsuccessful attempt, he was ridiculed quite a lot in the press about how he was going to be a savior, how he was going to end the war. That didn't happen in 1915. So fast forward to April of 1917, when the United States does declare war on the Axis powers because of the unlimited submarine warfare. There was also the Zimmerman letter, where a Mexican ambassador received a letter from a German envoy about how the German Axis powers were willing to give back the southern part of the United States if Mexico helped win the war. There were a number of things. The Lusitania also happened in 1915, and there was a large public outcry for that. So that kind of sets the stage. Henry Ford comes out and says that he will hire a army of lawyers to keep his son Edsel from being drafted, keep him out of the war.
But how did Henry Ford think he was going to go over there and stop the war with just going over to Europe and talking to people?
He just felt that the power of what he kind of thought of as common sense or a public outcry. He even paid money to have articles and quotes and things published in pamphlet form, put in newspapers about the religious aspects of how war was wrong, killing our fellow man. He really thought that, again, making public statements to tell them how foolish they were for fighting, he thought that was going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And again, by 1915, the war was pretty well on, and the powers were pretty much entrenched, fighting what turned out to be a very bloody war.
Oh, yeah.
So the public saw Henry Ford talking and were very aware of him, obviously, as a self-made, by that point, probably billionaire in the country. And it embarrassed Edsel. It really, really set him back. He didn't necessarily want to go any more than anyone else, but it also he felt it made him look bad. He was a rich, entitled young man, but he wasn't going to be doing what the guy next to him was, the regular American. He wasn't going to be going and fighting, even though he wanted to contribute. So at that point in 1917, the idea was either work or fight. That was a very big public push, that you will either go fight as an American soldier, or you will somehow wind up working in a factory trying to forward the American effort. He was already an executive as far as production and things like that within the Ford company. And reality is, he wouldn't have been doing anything better in the trench versus what he could do at the home front as far as mobilizing Ford and other companies to produce things for the war. And a different example would have been Major League Baseball. You had people like Ty Cobb, Christy Mathewson, who wound up in the Army and actually went overseas. Babe Ruth winds up in a shipyard doing his part after a little bit of some publicity on his part. So those guys got the message, work or fight. Edsel Ford winds up just kind of gearing the family business towards what can be done. Can they make armor? Can they produce things for the war effort? They actually don't do a whole lot. Ford Motor Company, the war was over reasonably quickly. They did start producing what were called Liberty engines, which were going to be airplane engines. However, by that point, the Allies were using either French or British aircraft during the war, so those weren't even really needed. But many people, researchers, biographers, felt that that experience for Edsel kind of scarred him, that he was in the public eye and had his dad behind him saying, what as an adult what he was and wasn't going to do.
Do you think his formal education, had anything to do with this split between him and his father over this issue?
There was the relationship between Henry and Edsel over the years it's a very intense one. It's a very interesting one. At times, they are almost inseparable. They are of the same mind with a lot of things, but then also there are severe deviances where Edsel wants to go in one direction with the company, Henry wants to go in a different direction. That's part of it, and they seem to get through those pretty well in the early years prior to World War II. They disagreed, but Dad usually won out. But Edsel still tried to have a say in the company, and he tried to help steer the company. The other part that was a significant difference between the two of them, Edsel seems more of a well-rounded person, a more cosmopolitan person. He enjoys the arts. He's on many boards for many museums. He's part of many different charities. He has friends in many different walks of life, and that doesn't seem to be the same as his father. His father did have many friends, of course, Thomas Edison and people like that, but it doesn't seem that Henry had such a wide view of the world. He was interested in producing Model Ts. In his spare time, he and Edison and Firestone and some of the other guys went off on very famous camping trips, things like that. And if you've been down the road to the Henry Ford Museum, you certainly would have seen some of those exhibits. And Edsel went to parties. He did once or twice drink. He did once or twice smoke. And those were things that Henry was very much against and not a party to. So, yeah. So they're father-son, and they're very close. And the Ford Motor Company was to both of them, the be-all, end-all. It was their thing. It was a world-changing institution, which it certainly was. Yet, in other areas, Edsel was a stark contrast to his dad.
I think there was some dynamic between Edsel and his mother also. Is that correct?
People did say that Edsel was more like his mother, which kind of painted him as more sensitive, maybe a little bit softer, more, I don't want to say an easy touch, but he had more sympathies and things like that to the common folk. And again, he was on many, many charity boards and did try to look out for other people that maybe was not the same focus as Henry.
Now, I think I also read that Edsel tried to start his own, not his own, but as one of his projects at the Ford Motor Company, an airline business. Is that true?
That is true. And again, that's why I said that the production of the B-24 Liberator was not the Ford Motor Company's first entry into aviation. Yes, in the mid-1920s, the company, Ford Motor Company, purchases a local airplane manufacturing stout metal airplane. And because the Stout was constantly in debt, or they had money issues, Ford did not. So they buy it. And so from about 1925 on, they are into aviation. And one of the byproducts of that was eventually the Ford Trimotor. Ford Trimotor was a very, very close copy of Anthony Foker's airplane, and that is not a coincidence. There was an incident where Anthony Foker was post-World War I, and for those that may not know, Anthony Foker was a Dutch airplane manufacturer, and he built up a pretty big fortune during World War I. Although he was Dutch, he worked for the Germans, so Dutch versus Deutsch was a little bit confusing. So Fokker was very quick to point out that he was Dutch, he was not German. But during World War I, he was very successful in building airplanes of different kinds and a number of innovations for the Axis powers in the war. War's over, he had lost his fortune and then started up again. So at one point he has a tri-motor aircraft, which was made primarily out of wood, brings it over to the United States. There's some manufacturing going on here in the United States, but Ford sees it. And when he comes to visit Henry Ford, Ford's photographers, Ford's engineers get up close and personal with the aircraft. And lo and behold, not too much later, the Ford company starts producing an aircraft that looks, like I said, remarkably similar to the Fokker aircraft. However, this one is out of aluminum. It's a metal aircraft, and it is very successful as far as what it's designed to do. It becomes eventually, in late 1920s, a kind of the leading cargo and the leading passenger aircraft available in the United States.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay, leading passenger. Okay.
As far as aviation goes, sometimes it's hard to keep track, but post Wright brothers, there is a huge scramble across the country and across the world, competing airplanes, and it's like Orville and Wilbur kicked off like a thing of dominoes, and then everybody jumps in, and planes are coming left and right, all kinds of innovations. But the trimotor was pretty unique in that it was all metal. That was there. Then there were other smaller manufacturers that had been doing it, but as far as a mass-produced, successful airplane that was all metal, the trimotor was leading the charge.
Now, did the Ford Motor Company ever consult with the Wright brothers on the aircraft?
That is a great question, and I don't know exactly. I won't say yes because I don't know. Orville dies in 1912. Excuse me, Wilbur. Got it backwards. Wilbur dies in 1912. Orville is very heavily involved in lawsuits and things like that, and also trying to develop more planes. I don't know of an instance where they did then. Later on in the 1930s, there's a relationship that develops between the Ford family and Orville Wright, which I'm leaping around here.
Yeah,
I apologize for that.
Okay.
That's how the Wright Cycle Shop and the Wright family home winds up at Greenfield Village.
Yeah.
Because of the relationship that the Motor Fords had with the Wrights.
We should probably explain because some in the audience may not know about Greenfield Village.
Yes. Greenfield Village was Henry Ford's attempt to kind of have a bookmark in time. He went around the country, his people went around the country, buying old buildings and then having them disassembled and moved to an area in Dearborn that became what is still today a kind of a museum outdoors of full buildings and things. There's a number of historic buildings. Thomas Edison's laboratory from Menlo Park, New Jersey is there. There's also the Logan County Courthouse, which was a courthouse where Abraham Lincoln, practiced when he was a lawyer riding the circuit. So yes, that was actually kind of a start of it that at Greenfield Village, Henry Ford wanted to preserve history. One of the many ironies of Henry Ford is that he was modernizing the world with his automobile and his airplanes and things like that, yet he also very much did not like the changing of times. He wanted things to stay the way they were. He liked things being done the old-fashioned way. So we could probably talk for days about Henry Ford and all of his eccentricities.
And didn't Ford also build an airport right next to Greenfield Village?
Those all kind of came at the same time, 1925, 26, 27, right in there. He buys the airplane company. They they build a factory right there on the property. They build a very, very fancy, very well done private airport. They are often given credit for having the first cement runway in an airport. Prior to that, it was mostly grass or field runways. The Ford Airport, as it became known, was the one to have the first cement runway.
Oh, I didn't know that either. That's good. But now there's a test track there.
Yes. All of that. The Dearborn Inn, which is right across the road, was actually a hotel that was going to service passengers in and out and pilots and things like that. Yes, the airport is not so much an airport anymore. It's a test track. And then some of the buildings that were used to build the trimotors have now, I believe they're still there, but those are now different parts of the automobile company, experimental buildings and things like that. But a lot of what happened in the 20s affected Dearborn, and it affected aviation and things like that.
Now, did they try to build these early aircraft in a production line type manner, or was it more one at a time?
It's more one at a time. What we're going to find when Willow Run plant is up and running and is being conceived is, yes, the key is going to be a more automobile type production. But as far as the trimotor, they hadn't gotten to that yet.
Yeah.
They were still trying to work out the bugs and things. They end up producing in about 3 years, 199 trimotors, and it was very successful. Ford also dipped their toes into mail delivery. They wind up with those airplanes flying the mail from Detroit to Chicago, and I believe also Detroit to Cleveland. It became airmail. It was actually invented. They got a contract with the federal government to do that, and they used their planes to carry that out.
Now, did this expertise that they developed at this time, did any of that carry over into the late 30s when they were starting the plant here, or were those people kind of all gone by then?
I'm not sure about the specific engineers that would have been employed in the 20s and then again at the Willow Run plant, but it seems like it ended abruptly as far as the Ford Motor Company's involvement in aviation. And researchers, historians kind of point to three different things. One of the other things that Ford did was they kind of toyed, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but they kind of toyed around with small individual aircraft, and with the thought that long term, had it continued, and Ford stayed in aviation at that point, that the idea where every household has a Model T, and that's where his millions and billions came from.
Yeah.
The idea was long term, perhaps every house would also have a small single person aircraft. And so they had some of those that they were building, smaller ones, and those never went into mass production. They kind of, again, were experimental. 1927, one of Ford's close employees, he winds up with one of those airplanes, and he's going to fly it from Michigan to Florida, just to go down there, but also to set a record for like nonstop flight, long distance flight for a smaller single engine, single person aircraft. Unfortunately, when he gets down to Florida, he winds up crashing into the ocean. The plane is recovered. His body is never recovered. That person was close to Henry Ford, so that seemed to possibly change Henry Ford's mind. Same time, a little bit within a year or two after that as well, the Great Depression comes along, and where they had been selling quite a few tri-motors to other companies in the 1927, 1928. By the time the Great Depression hits, sales drop through the basement. People aren't buying airplanes. They're not going to do that anymore for a while because of the uncertainty with the national economy. That happens. So that's number two. And what seems to be the third strike is a person we haven't mentioned yet, but one of Ford's chief engineers, a man named Charlie Sorensen, also known as Cast Iron Charlie. He was step by step in lockstep with Henry Ford about production of the Model A, the Model T, the Rouge plant, and those kind of things. For some reason, and he writes about it a little bit in his own book, but others have commented on it, he just wasn't a real fan of aviation. He was not very enthusiastic about it. So those things seem to combine, and I would think economically the Depression would have had the biggest effect on it. But Ford stops building tri-motors, and for a while they just kind of put a bookmark in it and set it aside. That Ford aviation just no longer is a thing. They don't focus on it, and they stop building airplanes.
So let me be clear about the tri-motor. So that would be one motor on each wing and then a motor on the front?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's what
it was called the Tin Goose. It was nicknamed with the Tin Goose. And it is been referred to by some people that I know of as kind of an aluminum can with engines on it. As a side note and a shameless plug, we here at the Michigan Flight Museum, we actually have our own Ford tri-motor.
Oh.
It is flight worthy. It is in our hangar. They're working on some of the brakes have sometimes been a little bit of an issue, and there's been some other things, but within the next several months, we're actually hoping to have it up and flying again. And it's going to be available for people to purchase rides. Like I said, shameless plug. But yeah, we own number 42. It was the 42nd tri-motor ever made. It's an interesting bird. It can hold about 12 people, and the interior usually has, each one is a little bit different, but it has wicker seats. It has almost like a wallpaper on the side. Some of the other tri-motors that were in existence kind of almost had, I don't want to say a chandelier, but it had very ornate lights on the side. So it was sometimes used as a cargo plane in different versions, but also it was kind of an upscale passenger aircraft for people to be in. So yes, that was its main thing. Tri-motor, it's three engines for the one plane.
Yeah. It must have been kind of cold and noisy in there, though.
It is. It is a noisy aircraft,
Yeah.
and although I've never flown in one, and I have been in ours, and I've been in some of the other ones. Another note is that, like traditional airplanes,
Yeah.
the fuel tanks are in the wings.
Yeah.
In the trimotor, the wing it's an overhead wing, so in essence, the fuel tank is over the heads of the passenger, and that can be a little disconcerting.
Yes.
I
I see. Okay, so so maybe
So let me.
yeah,
I will go on. So yeah, so that gets you into the early
30s,
1930s
30s. Yep.
with the Ford Motor Company
Yeah.
as far as aviation. Along that same time, Henry Ford had continued his habit. He had a he was the son of a farmer and the grandson of a farmer. So farming to him then, as for the rest of his life, was very important. He purchased a number of small farms in southeastern Michigan. And one of the farms he bought was in 1931. He purchases 1,700 acres, about 1,700 acres, out in what is now the area of Belleville, east of Ypsilanti. So for 10 years, about 1931 into 1941, that farm, it was a working farm. It had a few different reasons to exist. It had a few purposes. And one of them was they would bring out, the Ford company would bring out young males, either disadvantaged youths, orphans, or even just other kids. They'd bring them out to that farm for the summer and teach them how to farm, how to plant crops, rotate crops, drive the tractors, those kind of things. That really sets the stage for where Willow Run comes to. So they're doing that for about 10 years out there. And Henry Ford would come out and just walk the land. Loved, having his hands in the dirt and all those kind of very Americana type things. That is part of what eventually becomes Willow Run.
But isn't there some kind of I don't know, say Ford one of the reasons that he didn't want to stay a farmer is because he thought the work was kind of drudgery, right? But he still had this connection
Yes.
with the soil, right?
Yeah, he did. He was restless, and the thing that's been pointed out over and over, he liked to work with his hands,
Yeah.
but as far as creating and tinkering is the word that usually comes up. So while farming was in his blood, and he realized the backbone of America, it was again another one of the dichotomies of him.
Yeah.
He loved farms. He bought little farms here and there across the area. He bought the really big farm. Yet, yeah, he also seemed to be very much at home in a loud, deafening factory that smelled of oil and gas and all kinds of things. So he was both. The property out here at Willow Run was just another purchase for him, and they used it they often planted, I believe soybeans was his favorite crop anyway, and what could be done with a soybean. But it was primarily a soybean farm. 20, well, I was going to say 20 minutes, but that's our travel time now. Half hour outside of Detroit and Dearborn.
Yeah, I live in Saline, and apparently Ford set up a manufacturing plant there to make plastics from soybean. That's what story I've heard, and so to this day, around Saline there are a multitude of soybean farmers, and there is still a Ford. Well, it's not a Ford plant anymore. I'm not sure who owns it.
Good point. Yeah, on Michigan Ave. I'm not sure who owns
Michigan.
That one this week.
Yeah, it's maybe Stellantis. I'm not sure, but some European manufacturer now owns that plant. And
Ford had an enormous impact in many different ways that you don't think about, and I would suggest to you that farming was one of them. And the Henry Ford Museum, or I think they've changed their name as well.
The Ford,
the Ford. They, some of their early exhibits, up to this day, are just combines and reapers and tractors and every possible thing you could think of. And Henry set out to do that as well. He specifically went around the country buying things, buying old pieces of furniture, old equipment, because he wanted to preserve that, put them in the museum. But if you pulled it out of him, I think his first love would probably was and would always been farming and been out in the middle of nowhere walking his soybean fields. That's kind of how I picture it. That's how I have it in my head.
Okay, so during this time now, say from the late 20s into the mid 30s, we still have Etzel Ford. So he must be, he's maturing. He's this upstanding person in the Detroit area, and but it seems that Henry Ford himself was kind of more withdrawing from sort of the cultural world and the. Is that true or not?
I would say, yeah, that we do find that as he grows older, Henry becomes a little more eccentric and a little more withdrawn. Now, I want to say 1919, 1920, right after World War One, Edsel is given the company. Essentially, you're the president, you're in charge. Yet, in spite of that, Dad is always over his shoulder. There was a struggle with them about trying to diversify their cars. We're going to try different things. We're going to try different models, different things. And it did happen, but it's important to keep in mind that Henry's standing behind Edsel saying, we're just going to make we're going to make the Model T, and we're going to make, like, the old saying was, you can have any color you want as long as it's black.
Yeah.
That type of thing seemed to be the mentality of Henry Ford. And Edsel kind of chafed under that. He wanted to race. He was into yachts, boating. His house over, I believe, in the Points.
Grosse Pointe.
He had a yacht tied up there. He traveled the world and wanted to do different things, and that's kind of where father and son parted ways slowly. But again, still, it was said even on his deathbed that Edsel just worshipped his father. It's just, unfortunately, they had some very different ideas about eventually World War II and the direction that the motor company should go.
Okay, and so maybe this is a little early to bring it up, but so when does Harry Bennett start coming into the picture here in that story?
Yeah, Harry Bennett is also a very controversial figure. Depending on which author you read, you get an idea of kind of a brawling thug, but then also a different author will come back and say that he was Henry's closest confidant, and early 1920s, they bump into each other in New York City. It was kind of a very odd meeting between Henry and Harry. And eventually, Henry invites him to come back to Michigan. I'll give you a job. And again, through the 20s and into the 30s, what became known as the Ford Service or Ford Force. Harry Bennett is behind it, and he just kind of becomes a fixer for Henry. If you need something done, tell him. Well, Henry would tell him, and it just kind of gets done. But part of his reputation stems from the fact that he had a number of connections, a number of relationships kind of in the local Detroit underworld. He knew quite a few called mobsters and things like that, and he leveraged it all to his advantage. If something needed to get done, he knew the people to do it. Bennett, that is. And what is sad to me is towards the end, because of Henry's changing outlook, things like that, Harry actually becomes closer to Henry than his own son Edsel, and that really is kind of a modern day tragedy when it goes. But yes, in the 20s he shows up and then slowly starts gaining power. At one point, it's claimed that the Ford Service is the largest private police force in the world. Strikes and things happen. There's issues in any of the factories. They send in their own force. Bennett winds up, even though he's not really on the payroll, he winds up with building what was called the castle in Ann Arbor, where he was from, and his power just seems to be limitless within the Ford organization. And at a couple of different points, Henry comes out and says, "You report directly to me. I'm the only one that can fire you. You work at my pleasure." Which, again, that kind of power is pretty limitless in an organization like that. So he's around. Yeah, he is in the background from the 20s on.
I think that is that Bennett House still on the Huron River?
That is my understanding.
Yeah.
The castle is supposed to be out
Yeah.
there. I've never been there or been by it, which I kind of kick myself now. But I would like to go see it. Yeah, it's supposed to be an enormous castle. Had any number of like things on the inside, like shooting ranges and a bowling alley and theaters. I mean, just very, very odd for the 1920s and 30s. It's also supposed to have tunnels, like escape tunnels coming out of it. Some of these might be legends and some might actually be factual. I don't know. And I'd love to know who owns it right now.
Yeah.
Who lives there. That would be fascinating too.
There's a Ford cabin up in Tawas, Michigan, on the Lake Huron, just north of town. And supposedly, there's a cement walk in the back into the back of the house. And on that sidewalk are two initials scratched into the two sets of initials scratched into the cement. I guess when they poured it, and one is allegedly supposed to be Harry Bennett's initials, and the other one is his girlfriend.
Okay.
That's the legend.
That is interesting. Yeah, that would be fun to pull that apart and find out the stories, and if you could actually run that down and prove it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Bennett is just kind of in one hand, he's behind the scenes, kind of in the shadows, but on the other hand, his influence over Ford, both the person and the company, is enormous. After he was gone, there were many, many people that said, they were terrified of him. They didn't want anything to do with him. He was known to carry a gun. He also kind of apparently stoked some of Henry's paranoia by suggesting that Edsel's wife or any of their kids might be kidnapped at any moment. So he needed to kind of beef up and have security, and everything needed to come through him. We also kind of feel that at the end, Bennett figured he was going to wind up being president of the company eventually because of his relationship and his manipulation of Henry. That doesn't happen, but that's really getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. Okay, so what year are we now? We're a couple years before the war, before 1939. I say 1937 or something.
Yeah, I would say the story kind of picks up in 39. The September of 39. The world is now aware of the war. You can kind of make a strong case with Hitler gobbling up other countries in Europe before that, and then what the Imperial Japanese are doing in Asia. That World War II actually starts a couple of years before that, what they're doing in China and what they're doing in Korea. But officially, yes, World War II ramps up when Hitler and Stalin invade Poland, and we're off and running. Mm-hmm. The initial reaction is going to be that Henry Ford, again, goes back to kind of his roots. He wants nothing to do with the war. He wants to stay out of it as far as a country and stay out of it as far as the motor company goes. He was, even a couple of years before that, he was approached by Charles Lindbergh about the America First program, which everybody saw. I mean, the start of World War II was like the worst kept secret ever. The world was heading that way for many, many years. And so even before the fighting starts, some Americans wanted to make it known to the federal government that we didn't want anything to do with it. That's Europe's war. And Henry Ford was briefly a member of the America First group headed by Lindbergh and some other ones. He eventually kind of gets uncomfortable, a little squeamish, and drops out. But overall, he still supports the idea that the United States should stay neutral in every facet. We're just not going to have anything to do with what's going on over there. Mm-hmm. And even before that, if you have a working knowledge of the politics of the time, Henry Ford and Franklin Roosevelt were polar opposites. They did not get along. Henry Ford was very offended by the New Deal. The New Deal is going to come in and change society during the Depression. And Henry Ford wanted nothing to do with that either. The federal government is telling us what to do. Now we're doing things like Social Security and price controls and all those types of government control. Henry Ford felt that those were reaches, and so late 1930s, he very much dislikes President Roosevelt, and they're not friends in any shape or form. There was FDR invites him to Washington for a meeting, and he originally says he's not going to go. I don't want to talk to that man. Then he does go. The meeting is pretty non-committal, and I think more than anything else, it probably cemented them as adversaries than anything else prior to the war.
So at this meeting, did Roosevelt talk to Ford about the coming of the war and what might be necessary?
There wasn't an actual record kept of it, but I think that was part of it. And also, my assumption, knowing President Roosevelt, was probably an attempt at some cajoling. Come on board, support the New Deal. We've got millions of people out of work, that type of thing. And it didn't seem to stick. They did not see eye to eye.
Yeah. Okay.
So the war starts, 1939. President Roosevelt puts together another alphabet soup worth of federal bureaucracies, things like that, to try to get the country moving towards mobilization. 1940, the Selective Service Act starts, so men are drafted into service. It's going to be more of a National Guard type situation early on, limited couple-year enlistment period, but everybody has to register for it because the war clouds are coming or they're forming, and it looks somehow the United States is going to get involved in the war. I don't think any person living at the time would have legitimately thought that that we're going to stay out of it 100%. But that starts in 1940. Something else that's going on is they start mobilizing some of the manufacturing capabilities. 1940. I think it was the spring of 1940, the British government, through our federal government, approaches Ford Motor Company to ask them to build airplane engines. It is the Merlin engine that eventually wins the fame in the Spitfire British aircraft fighter plane and helps win the Battle of Britain and so forth. The British, like anyone else, are fighting a two-front war along with the French. They're in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, and they're in Europe fighting Hitler. They can produce some things, but they can't fight a two-front war and produce enough weapons to fight it with. So they turn to the United States. Can you build us aircraft engines? That request goes from the British to the federal government to the Ford Motor Company. Edsel gets the request. He takes it to Dad and says, look, they want us to build 9,000 engines for British aircraft, and we're going to actually divide it up. We're going to have, I believe it's 3,000 for the British, 6,000 for us. And can we do that? Let's do that, Dad. Initial response from Henry is, okay, yeah, let's do that. We'll make them for us, for our own preparedness, for our own self-defense, but I don't want anything going off to war. I don't want to be more of the aggressor. So it was going to be 9,000, then it's going to be 3,000, and there's a huge publicity campaign about Ford is in. We're doing this. We're helping out. We're helping our allies. And FDR is off to the side clapping. Thank you, Ford. Thank you, Edsel. One day before the project actually even starts, Henry Ford changes his mind. No, we're not doing it. I want nothing to do with it. I don't want to be in this. It's only going to be a warmongering type situation. I refuse. Stop. Edsel is crushed. If for no other reason, he thought that this was going to be the way in for them to be involved and help the country, but also on a personal level, it's a humiliation. He had worked this out. It was again publicized tremendously, and now Dad says, no, we can't do it. So he has to pick up the phone and call Washington and say, Dad changed his mind. We're not doing it. Eventually, the Packard company winds up building those aircraft engine for the war effort, but spring to midsummer of 1940, the other companies, Cadillac, Chrysler, Packard, Studebaker, all the big ones are starting to gear up and starting to build things for the United States military and things that we're going to actually be given or leased to our British and French allies, but not Ford. Ford is still kind of got the blinders on, just motoring along. That's a good one. They're building passenger cars, and that's what they're going to keep doing. We're just going to keep doing it, and it does kind of give a black eye to the Ford company.
Now, did Harry Bennett have anything to do with the decision of the old man to stay out of the war, or did he didn't have any political, leanings or anything like that?
I've never seen anything that really described much about Bennett's thoughts one way or the other as far as the war and pacifism or not being involved. Someone within the company and biographers later on made a really good point as far as Bennett goes. Whatever Henry wanted, he told Bennett to do it, and it kind of seemed like Harry Bennett was the bad guy. He was the designated heavy, even if it didn't look so good for the company, yet maybe Henry wanted it to happen. He just pushed it off or had Harry be his bad guy or the heavy as far as getting things done that might be unpleasant. So that I said earlier that he's controversial. Some people claim that he was he was the criminal element to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Others have said all he was doing was carrying out Henry's orders.
Yeah.
And so he was the paid bad guy. I don't think there was been much written or spoken about whether Bennett cared one way or the other.
And wasn't there the confrontation at the Rouge plant? Labor?
Yes. Yeah, there was a pretty violent, pretty awful strike, and that was in the effort to organize and to unionize. The Bennett armed any number of strike breakers. They had clubs, weapons, rocks and things, and it got incredibly ugly. People died. There was a bloody standoff at one point.
What year would that be?
One of them was in 38.
38, yeah.
And then once we get into the war, there are some other ones that are much shorter, but there were also some pretty violent confrontations. The well-kept or the secret that's out there, from the 30s into the end of World War II, there were thousands of labor strikes in the regular automotive industry, and then when they gear up to do military weapons and things like that. And it kind of paints a different picture when you look at it that at Ford alone, there would be like a half a day strike, there would be a full day strike, there would be a week or so, and it really gives you a different look. The patriotism and America, we're all going to join together and we're going to fight, we're going to win the war, we're going to focus on that. Is there, and it's absolutely truthful. But the other part is, if you worked in the factories, it was a job. You can't buy a loaf of bread with patriotism. You can't just tell your landlord, I'm not really getting paid a decent wage, but it's for Uncle Sam kind of a thing. So there were strikes, and a lot of them actually happened, not just Ford, but the other manufacturers as well, in the thousands for the time frame between 1941 and 1945. And the majority of them actually were more of an effort to get the workers' causes and grievances and things in front of a labor relations board. So they would have a really short one, and then the government would come in and try to mediate. But yeah, Harry Bennett had no sympathy for striking workers. His idea again was, I'm gonna bring in my force of thousands, and we're going to beat them over the head. We're gonna drag them out of the factory. We're gonna bring in somebody else to make the cars, and let's move along. He just did not. He was not sentimental. He didn't tolerate things that were going against Ford.
Were there any attempts on his life in that time?
There was.
On Bennett's life.
There was. He reported a couple times that he was driving somewhere in his car in downtown Detroit or on his way, and someone shot at his car. He reported that a shotgun blast blew out the window of his car, but he kind of he saw himself. He'd been in the Navy as a teenager. He also had made a name for himself as a kind of a semi-pro boxer.
So he was a tough guy.
He was, and yet he tried. And again, part of history I love is both sides of it. So he is a tough guy, but he had tattoos up and down his arms, but to kind of fit in a more professional, more upstanding kind of way in the motor company executive role, he always wore long sleeves to try to kind of hide it. So he's tough, but he's also trying to fit in as an executive. And I would say it's because he saw himself eventually winding up as the head of Ford Motor Company.
And Edsel Ford must have known that Bennett had these aspirations. Is that correct?
Yes, there was really no doubt in Edsel's mind what was going on, and that Edsel felt that Bennett was kind of manipulating his dad behind the scenes, and he just, at the end of Edsel's life, it really became kind of a him or me situation between Bennett and Edsel towards his father. And if he would have continued to push it, seems likely that Henry would have probably chosen Bennett because of the rift that was between them at that point.
Wow.
And again, that's, how sad is that? But that kind of was the way it was. Also, that it's important to note, somewhere around the time that Henry decided not to build the aircraft engines for the British, Charlie Sorensen reports in his book, it's a pretty good book, My 40 Years at Ford. In that book, he kind of notes, and I don't know if it was common knowledge, but he believed at the time that Henry was suffering small strokes. And it was kind of changing some of his points of views, changing his personality a little bit. And then also by that point in the war, in the early to 40s and so on, Henry's probably showing some signs of dementia.
Yeah.
He occasionally would call for, in his office, he'd call for somebody, an engineer, a designer, somebody who hadn't been there in 20 years. He was seen talking to himself and things like that. So again, a lot of balls up in the air, and a lot of things are happening all at the same time, including whatever changes Henry was going through.
So I think we should talk about this Mr. Sorensen, because he's supposedly this manufacturing genius, right?
Yes.
And he made this. So he's very instrumental in getting the bomber plant going. So I guess what we need the story is, okay, how did that bomber plant finally get going, and what was Sorensen's role in doing that?
After the debacle with the engines not being produced, it's kind of quiet as far as Ford is concerned. There is a rumor circulating. There's no real source for the rumor, but there's a rumor circulating that the Roosevelt administration is frustrated with Ford not participating, not being available, or not being willing to jump in and start manufacturing things for the war effort. So from summer into December, the talk is that the federal government is going to nationalize Ford Motor Company. They're going to use their War Powers Act, executive orders, whatever it takes. They're going to come in and literally physically take over the plant, push the Ford family out, and then just take it and run with it. And as a matter of fact, that did cause one pretty heated argument between Edsel and Henry. Edsel was explaining this to his father, and in disgust or in anger, Henry throws up his hands and says, "Well, then the government now has a motor company. They can do whatever they want." And he kind of storms off. Edsel comes back and kind of works on his dad a little bit more, and slowly kind of wears him down. End of December it was actually December 29th, 1940, President Roosevelt comes on the radio and makes his now very famous Arsenal of Democracy speech. The United States we're not sending our boys overseas. However, we have friends over there, and they're fighting for democracy against the fascists. So we're going to harness the manufacturing might of the United States, and we are going to build things for them. We're going to prepare ourselves for war, but we're also going to build things for our allies. That is the end of 1940. The next week, or 2 weeks after that, Edsel Ford, Charlie Sorensen, Henry Ford II, his son, Edsel's son, and also Benson, his son. The four of them, along with a team of engineers and some other people, go out to California. And part of this also is spurred on. There's a story that Jimmy Doolittle, at the time, he was in the interwar years, he was a famous racer, planes, cars, all kinds of things, and he had built up a name and a reputation. Doolittle calls Edsel and tries to get to Henry, saying, "Look, help us out. Will you do this? Will you start building airplanes? That kind of resonates a little bit more, I guess, than some other things. Before that, another fellow we should talk about, William Knudsen, winds up. He also calls Henry Ford, asking to make some things for the war effort. Henry says, absolutely not. For whatever reason, the call from Knudsen pushes him away from it, and he says no. Doolittle kind of makes a little more inroads through Edsel and through these conversations.
We should mention who Knudsen is, really.
Yeah, absolutely. William Knudsen, he actually started out as a Ford employee. He actually he was a Dutch immigrant, and he winds up in the state of New York. He works for different companies, manufacturing companies. For a while, he was with one that built bicycles, of all things, in the Buffalo area. And then he's a rising star. He's a production genius. His ideas, his encouragement, his things can turn small companies into larger ones. And when if you're making 100 cars a day, Knudsen has the magic wand somehow mysteriously, and then he can up production through the roof. He winds up in the teens working for Henry Ford for about a 10-year span. Then there's kind of, I wouldn't say a rift, but he gets a better job offer. He winds up eventually at General Motors. At General Motors, in about a 10-year span, he pushes General Motors past Ford and past Chrysler to be the #1 automobile manufacturer, particularly Chevrolet, in the country. So he's a production genius. 1940, 1941, the Roosevelt administration calls him up and says, we need you to come to Washington, and we need you to be in charge of war production. By that point, he was an executive. So this is 1930s. He was to 40s. He was making about $500,000 a year.
Wow.
At that time, yeah. I mean, nowadays that's Musk or Taylor Swift money now. Yeah. I mean, that kind of a thing. So he reluctantly says, okay. He resigns from General Motors and comes to Washington to be in charge of war production. And he was one of the bigger names, but one of the first of the $1 a year man. Federal government recruits a number of executives like himself, and they pay him $1 a year to come to Washington and kind of handle this mobilization and the ramping up of all that. So yes, the United States is still neutral, but it's 1940, it's early 41. Knudsen tries to push Ford into manufacturing something. Ford absolutely says no. Now we get to the end of December 40 and January 41. So the call from Doolittle and some other things happen that finds Sorensen, Edsel, and family and some employees out in San Diego at the Consolidated Aircraft.
Consolidated Aircraft, yes.
Yes, they make their first appearance
yes.
In our story. Yes, Consolidated Aircraft, they've been around for a number of years out in San Diego, and probably prior to the B-24, one of their more famous products was what we call the Pan Am Clipper ship. Giant flying boats that were traversing the Pacific like crazy, but they are an enormous aircraft, and it was a luxury aircraft, but it had several distinct features to it, and they were responsible for that one. They also kind of had their eye on other types of flying boats. We find in World War II that another one of their famous products is the PBY Catalina, which is, again, a large flying boat, essentially, that was invaluable during the Pacific War.
But they only made one at a time, is that right?
That is the issue, and that is what was appalling to Edsel and Sorensen when they go out there. Their manufacturing style was antiquated. It was kind of an artisan situation where they brought in a lot of their parts from other factories, so they had a lot of people making parts for them, which in regular time that can be okay. Time of war, when speed and other things are very valuable, you're going to want to make it faster. We need the parts when we need them. We can't wait for suppliers to do that. So yes, the four of them go out. There's more than that, but the nicer legend has Edsel, his two kids, and Sorensen walking around the plant out in San Diego. The original idea, and Consolidated was behind this, and they were for it to a degree. The original idea was that Ford Motor Company would stamp out and otherwise produce individual pieces for the Liberator and then ship them out to San Diego.
Oh, wait, we have to mention why the Liberator, what the Liberator was, because we
Yes.
have no.
Yes. So they're gonna, they wanted, Consolidated wanted Ford to produce the pieces of the plane for them, ship them out there, then they would still build them. B-24 Liberator had a few different names, a few different versions of it, but essentially it is a heavy four-engine bomber. It was conceived in about 1939. The Army Air Corps was taking submissions that they wanted to bring in and start building heavy bombers. 1935, 1936, and then we also add in the Spanish Civil War. The idea was that airplane manufacturing, specifically to military specs, they weren't quite sure what they were going to do. In the Spanish Civil War, there were a number of German and other produced medium range planes that were used extensively, and the Germans wind up doing a lot of experimenting in somebody else's war. But for a while, the United States Forces through the Army, they're not sure which direction they want to go. Do we want big heavy bombers that can fly halfway across the world? Do we want a few of them, or do we want a lot of smaller ones that can travel shorter distance, but we can have a lot? The prototype for the B-17, a very famous plane that plays a large role in World War II. At one point, the Army was about to cancel that program. They said, no, we're not really interested in these larger planes. We don't think we're going to need them. So the 17 was on the chopping block for a little while. And then someone kind of changed course on it. So the B-17 through Boeing winds up being delivered and developed. And shortly after that, the Consolidated comes up with the B-24. Mm-hmm. It was an enormous plane, had a wingspan of about 110 feet, and the fuselage from nose to tail is about 66 feet. As I mentioned, four very powerful 1,200 horsepower engines each. Pratt Whitney, the double wasp, which is again a very powerful engine that when you put four of them together for that large of an airplane, it makes quite a racket.
Yeah.
But and the 24 is an incredibly complex airplane. When World War II is going on, up until the development of another plane, we'll talk about later, but the B-24 Liberator was able to carry the most weight in bombs. It was able to travel the fastest, and it actually had the longest range. Mm. The downside to that was the wing to support all of that was called the Davis wing, and it was a thicker wing to support the fuel tanks to get you that long range. Pilots then and even some later will tell you that it was a very difficult airplane to fly. It was physically exhausting and was tough to fly. That's the trade-off. It can fly farther than a B-17, but the proponents and the fans of the B-17 will tell you that 17 was a better aircraft. In the Warbird community, a group that are very devoted, loyal people. Most people have their favorite plane and what they really like. There's usually the B-24 people and the B-17 people, and there's not a lot of room in between. But Consolidated builds this plane. They have the idea that out in San Diego, they would bring all the parts that they brought in from other places. They produced some of them to a pile, essentially, outside, and then their people, their manufacturers, their electricians, their mechanics would build that one plane from that pile of parts. Once that plane was done, they'd go over to the next pile and they would build that plane and so forth. There are many stories about the early Consolidated B-24s that were built that say inside the aircraft, the wiring, as an example, would be different depending on which electrician was working what day. And because of how it was also made, there were not a lot of, there was too much wiggle room, let's say, with the parts. So they would be into the corner of the plane, and then somebody's going to have to kind of right then and there build something in particular to get that plane finished and to move on. It drove the Ford people when they were out there looking at it. It drove them crazy.
That's what I heard. The Sorensen.
Yes.
Sorensen, who was this also manufacturing genius, is going, I know how to do this, right? I know how to. I know.
And the early planes did prove to be a problem. There were no universal replaceable parts. So if you had a problem with the wing or different things on the inside, you get battle damage or whatever. They didn't have a set of or availability of parts to replace that one because that one was handmade by itself. Sorensen, I would imagine probably had a heart attack out in San Diego looking at this. And the other thing, when they were touring the plant, they said, "Let us see your blueprints.
Yeah.
Show us your manufacturing, your sketches and things like that." They had some, they didn't have all of them, and some of the changes that they would make building each plane, they didn't record it, they didn't write it down. And again, this was just not the way you made anything, and it certainly did not represent how the Ford Motor Company would make cars. The first Model T should be exactly the same as the last Model T. That was not what was happening. So yes, they realized that all these planes had the potential to be great war aircraft. They were making about 4 to 5 a week. And some more legends kick in because depending on the research and who you talk to. But at that point, Sorensen goes back to his hotel room that night in San Diego, and on a paper placemat from the restaurant, sketches out what he claims would be a brand new, freshly built airplane factory back here in Michigan. And when they were up and running, when they were ready to go, that aircraft factory would be able to turn out 1 bomber an hour.
Yeah, geez.
And
that's pretty bold claim at that.
It really is. And as a matter of fact, he got ridiculed for that.
Yeah.
The pinnacle of airplane manufacturing at that time was Germany. They were able to turn out planes better, faster, and more of them, and they were deadly. And eventually, they wind up with the first working jet aircraft. But yes, the German high command and the German public and newspapers ridiculed this statement from Edsel and Sorensen, saying it's absurd. There's no way you can do that. It's just not going to happen. And they were laughed at. There are some other legends and tales that didn't exactly happen that way, that Sorensen did not sketch it out, but he said later that that's kind of how it happened. Some of these stories, and we'll find some other ones inside the plant, there's competing legends. And I love that because it is open for interpretation. And then you can also see what was happening at the time, that there's a rush to start building planes, and we're going to make this claim and we're going to say that, and we're going to go off and do something spectacular. And it does. It only increases the legend and the great stories about the plant and the bomber.
So I think we'll end the first interview here, maybe to say that I think that when Sorensen made that proposal, the federal government said, do it, right?
Yes. At the time, the federal government was kind of handing out money right and left. And they said, okay, if you can do that, we will give you a $200 million contract to start building those bombers. And as far as the factory, and we can talk more later about the factory, but the Ford Motor Company, he immediately, out of their own pocket, invest the first $50 million to build the factory. And we'll find out where the factory goes and all that as well.
Okay, so that'll be our second interview, and I think this is a good place to start because we've set the stage now for this factory, and then the struggles that go on for the next few years.
It does, and it's not instant airplane by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and we'll continue this story. I think it's a compelling story.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, here we go. Okay, thank you. Today, we wish to thank historian Karl Schmid for treating us to a thoughtful and informative interview as to the beginnings of the Willow Run bomber plant. We plan to have Karl back a second time to finish up this story of the creation and subsequent operation of the bomber plant during World War II. Before I started looking into this subject, I know I was certainly unaware of all the dramatic history associated with the bomber plant, which was just down the road from my home, so to speak. We can see that before the U.S. entered World War II, there were great efforts made to prepare for the war, and the Willow Run bomber plant was a prime example. Our next podcast will be with Sue Murray. Sue is one of the women who plays as Rosie the Riveter at the Yankee Air Museum. Sue will teach us about the life of the women who worked as laborers at the bomber plant, where up to 40% of the workforce there during the war were women. She will also tell us about the women who were at home, trying to keep the home and family together, while their husbands and fathers were away at war.
Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. The Great Lakes are a diamond on the hand of North America, a bright shining jewel on that friendship border ring. It's a freshwater highway coming down from Canada, and all along the coastline you can hear the people sing. Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie.